March 26, 2021 marks the 20th anniversary of the final broadcast, the last ever episode of WCW Monday Nitro. It also effectively marks the end of then one of the world's biggest wrestling promotions, World Championship Wrestling, which 3 days prior was bought by the World Wrestling Federation and the McMahon, now WWE, but I see that March 26, 2021, in my eyes, the day that WCW died. I'm going to talk about my fandom, the talents that I liked, and of course my thoughts 20 years on. I simply couldn't let this anniversary pass without doing a video talking about WCW. I became a fan of World Championship Wrestling in the latter 1980s. My dad, already known that I was a wrestling fan because we watched the British stuff, woke me up one night. We watched an episode of WCW. I really wish that I could remember who wrestled, what matches I saw, but I do know that I instantly became a fan of WCW. In this time period throughout the late 1980s into the mid 1990s, World Championship Wrestling was airing on ITV here in the UK. It was basically, the TV schedule was an hour-long episode on Saturday afternoon, which was then repeated many hours later, very, very late Saturday night, going into the early hours of Sunday morning. In those days, it was not unusual for WCW and actually WWE to pre-record their television shows. That actually meant sometimes a bonus for UK fans, because occasionally, instead of the Saturday night repeat being an actual repeat, they would instead show next week's episode of what, throughout this period I'm talking about now, certainly according to my memory, a lot of that time the programme was WCW Worldwide, but occasionally that episode was not a repeat of what was shown earlier that afternoon. It was a brand new episode. It was next week's episode of WCW Worldwide. Obviously it didn't happen all the time, which is why I used the word occasionally, but certainly in my memory it probably happened more than it should have. I don't think with all the regulations and checks that are probably done these days that it would happen now, but and I of course don't know the reasons why, but it certainly happened quite a few times, more than it possibly should have, even in those days. But it was a bonus, which obviously meant sometimes, some days, some Saturdays, you would be able to watch 2 brand new episodes of WCW, which was, of course, as a fan then, was brilliant. In those days, and I know I'm harping on about better technology here, but quite often in those days, if you missed a programme, you missed it. We didn't have, obviously, the on-demand services nowadays, and I'm not trying to make myself out like an old fogey, but it was simply the truth. We didn't have mountains of blank video cassettes, and we weren't always able to record what we wanted because my parents we wanted to record something or whatever reason. Sometimes if you missed the show, you just missed it. It was also in this period of the late 1980s into the early 1990s where the World Wrestling Federation also made inroads in the UK. Obviously on Sky, with live shows. WCW had occasional live shows as well, but certainly WWE made great inroads and became very popular here in the UK. It's no really wonder when you look at it why they had the over-the-top action, the larger-than-life characters, and all the glitz and glamour they were building upon following their successful launch of events like WrestleMania. Unfortunately, at that time period, and actually, looking back on it, you realise growing up that it wasn't just that stuff, it was also what must have been a really expensive media publicity and PR campaign. And in those days, all of that kind of meant that WCW, unfortunately over here as well, not just in the US, was seen as second class wrestling. It was seen as a kind of second class product, which I don't think was true. Looking at the talents that intrigued me, obviously there are many that are talked about nowadays. From the Ric Flair, Arn Anderson, Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, Dusty Rhodes, Terry Funk, all of those kind of guys, the NWA, WCW guys, many of them are talked about these days in reverence, and rightfully so. But there were other guys, and not just the Stings and Lex Lugers of the world, that intrigued me to watch WCW. But obviously, for me, people like the Steiner Brothers, my favourite tag team. If I have to pick one, it's easy to go to the Steiner Brothers for their skills. But there's also guys that are talked about nowadays, but really weren't then, especially. Guys like Rod Simmons, Cactus Jack, who obviously Mick Foley, we know what he's like. But guys like him, also guys like Johnny B. Bad, aka Mark Merrill, he was immensely entertaining, just made a lot more of the Johnny B. Bad character. I think it's been said now in recent years than what WCW thought would be. They thought it would be a kind of just an odd character that wouldn't work out, but he made it work. Also guys like, again he's talked about a lot now, but Dustin Rhodes. I always thought, I could even tell, when he joined WCW after the short run in WWE, I knew that he was really, really inexperienced. You could tell that. I could even tell that. But I always thought of him as a young cub with big paws, and he has, of course, over the years, grown into those paws. He's really, become a major star, a talented star, one of the most admired guys right now in wrestling. Obviously had a long career now, and I was behind guys like him, and there was a lot of young guys in WCW at the time as well, that came in over the years. So there was other talents, not just the main eventers, that actually intrigued me to watch WCW. I really don't want to sit here and really talk about WCW talent and the timeline of WCW. If you're really interested in watching videos about the WCW timeline, this sounds like an advert, but it's not. I discovered the channel quite a while ago, but I really recently, because of this anniversary and because I wanted to do this video, have been watching a lot of their videos. Wrestling Bios. It's a great channel. It has a lot of information, a lot of videos on WCW, the NWO stuff, and everything like that. So if you want to check that out, please do. There's some great details and summing up and looking at different angles and storylines. And talking about the NWO, honestly, I think the major turning point for WCW, for me, came in 1994 with the signing of Hulk Hogan. I still remember watching WCW Worldwide and watching the parade of him in the open top car, which was, I think, at the MGM, Disney MGM Studios, whatever it was, and being paraded and obviously signing the contract. I knew that WCW was changing. I knew that it was going to change. It has really become a kind of fashion in these last couple of years to not like Hulk Hogan, but I'll be honest, I've never really liked Hogan. Nothing against him personally in those days at least, but I just didn't like his act, his style of wrestling. Like I said, WCW was said as second class, termed as second class by many. I would always identify myself as a WCW guy, and to be honest, I prefer the WCW style of wrestling over WWE, just to make it kind of simple without me going into great lengths. I knew Hogan would change WCW. I didn't obviously know just how much, and 2 years later we would change that. The company basically became, with the introduction of the NWO, the Wolfpack, it all completely changed. You'd hardly believe it was the same company, and to be honest, as a fan of WCW at that time, I was extremely excited to see finally WCW getting recognition. Seeing people who were like, oh, WCW is rubbish, I'm not watching WCW, tune into it. It was fantastic. At that time, WCW was off ITV. It went off ITV at least very late 94, early 95. Certainly well after Hogan had joined, months after. Because I still remember sitting and watching some segment several months later. I think it was perhaps Hogan's real parents, but talking about their son and his success in wrestling and the success he'll be in WCW, or is already in WCW at that point. But that whole company, that NWO storyline, I'm glad it took WCW to the #1 spot in professional wrestling. I'm really glad to see, that WCW had that kind of success. If you're a supporter of a company, whether it's a wrestling promotion, a sports franchise, sports club, whatever it is, who are always maybe looked down at, you always want them to have success. Again, I'm not going to go into the whole WCW NWO angle because it's been talked about for the last 25 years actually, to be in fact now. And of course NWO are being inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame this year, and I'll do a separate video talking about that upcoming once we get more details on what is exactly happening with the Hall of Fame. But that was a major storyline. To cut a long story short, mistakes were made, things went wrong, and WCW eventually would crumble. I was told by one of my brothers that WCW had been bought by WWE, and to be honest, hearing that news, hearing that WCW would disappear, because I knew it would, in the hands of Vince McMahon and the World Wrestling Federation, I knew it would. I knew that WCW would cease to exist, which it did. I think it was fairly obvious that that was what was going to happen. And I was very sorry to hear that, to be honest. I knew that WCW was in trouble. By that time, wrestling magazines were obviously international. Wrestling magazines like Power Slab, for example, would have the latest, not just in-ring results, but talk about perhaps what they hear is going on behind the scenes. And, we would get to know a little bit about possibly what's going on. There was rumours about the Eric Bischoff takeover, which obviously didn't happen. And I was extremely sad. The company that I grew up watching from kind of the late 1980s, because I'm thinking about like kind of at least in 87, 88, which I know is the late 80s, but that kind of time period through to 2001, company that I'd invested so much in, had been a big fan of, bought the magazines, the action figures, the usual childhood stuff. To see that company disappear was a bit of a heartbreak for me, a lot, to be honest. It's just like say, any club, any sports franchise that suddenly disappears, it's terribly upsetting. And unfortunately, that's exactly what happened on the 26th of March 2001. There was an episode of WCW NITRO where it was revealed to the world, not that we didn't already know, that WCW had been bought by WWE. And again, that night has been talked about a lot. The episodes are on the network. Talking of the WWE network, my thoughts now, 20 years on. I think my honest thoughts about WCW World Championship Wrestling 20 years on is that I'm glad it's not completely disappeared. We went through a period of several years where obviously the WCW footage was simply not available. It was, after the WCW takeover by WWE and the ECW crumbling and the Alliance stuff, and we got some stuff on DVDs, releases, and some kind of documentary things, but access to the WCW stuff wasn't really there. But in the years before the network, it wasn't there. And that was a little bit heartbreaking as well for me, that fact that the possibility in those days that WCW would just basically cease to exist, the footage would be locked away, kept inside some dusty vault, and just be left there. which again was, and just we would just be left with the few VHS copies, VHS cassettes that we have available, which was very limited in the UK. And again, that's another one of the failures of WCW, was to really capitalise on sales of merchandise and DVD and VHS at that time. And obviously don't think they even got to any DVDs, but I thought, my fear was basically that WCW would disappear from wrestling history. So I think the first and foremost thought is that I'm really glad that on the WWE network, WCW is present. That we're able to go back and watch all the Nitros, the Thunders. I think at least a large majority of pay-per-views. I think there's odd one or two collaboration ones that aren't on the network. And I'm glad that it's there. I'm glad that WWE have been using the footage over this past 20 years for programs like the Monday Night Wars, documentaries about guys like Diamond Dallas Page, Hogan, and even the Outsiders, the NWO stuff. That WWE are using that footage, and that WCW still exists, even in a limited basis, on the WWE network. I think is really good. I know it doesn't interest everyone. I know that WCW isn't a nostalgia thing like ECW. I'm not sitting here and saying, oh, WCW, everybody should be so nostalgic for World Championship Wrestling. I fully understand there isn't any calls for WCW to return, to invite some of the WCW guys back, even for a WCW Legends reunion, etc. The induction to the Hall of Fame is the closest that some of them will get to being kind of returning in any sort of position. I understand that WCW is not a nostalgic product. People are not yearning for its return. And to be honest, neither am I. People keep saying, bring back the Attitude Era, where it's gone. The Attitude Era is dead and gone. It's not coming back. And to try and recreate such an era, it's impossible. The Attitude Era was off the cuff. It wasn't completely planned. To try and bring it back, especially with ignoring the physical capabilities of the performers these days, and in terms of the former Attitude Era stars, it's just not possible. So I'm not saying that WCW is a nostalgia thing to be, and that there's lots of money for WWE to invest in this. It's not. But I did want to mark this anniversary of WCW. I did want to talk about World Championship Wrestling. Like I said, I'm glad that the network is there. I'm glad I can go back, and I don't do it as often as I should. Go back, watch old Nitros, watch Thunders, watch the pay-per-views, even going back to the NWA stuff. I'm glad that we're able to do that. Because one of the things, and I'll kind of try and wrap this up now, one of the things I will say that during that Attitude Era, there was also, of course, the Monday Night Wars. It's called the Attitude Era, the Monday Night Wars. Call it what you will. But one thing that I've said for many years, now at least, some fans in those days were WCW fans, some were ECW fans, some were WWE fans. And some would only watch that company which they were fanatical about. I would honestly say to people, especially younger fans wanting to know the history of the business, it's something that I've always tried to encourage people to do, is to look at the later things. There isn't the footage, unfortunately, kind of prior to my days, as much as I would like to see on the network, and I don't know how much WWE have these days. I know they own several companies, but if you're a fan particularly of ECW or WWE or WCW, go back and watch the other companies' products. It's a long time since the Attitude Era Monday Night Wars time has finished, and there is no need to just say, oh, I'm not watching Nitro because Nitro was rubbish, I preferred Raw, or Nitro was good, Raw was rubbish. It's a good time, I think, to go back and enjoy WCW for what it was, at least until the late 1999 stuff, I think. I think the late 99 stuff was really when it started falling apart, in my opinion. But yeah, WCW, it's weird to think it's been 20 years. It's horrible to kind of think that it's been that long for almost, actually just over the majority of my life, WCW has now been gone. And it's a sad thing. You know, time moves on, life moves on, things happen, but yeah, World Championship Wrestling was a good promotion. Watch some of the matches, go through. There's some great talent, some great matches, some great events. Even if you try not to think of it in terms of the Attitude Era, the Monday Night Wars, and what was going on in the other sides, the other promotions, watch it and try and enjoy it for what it was. It's sad, WCW, as World Championship Wrestling, has been gone now for 20 years. It's a sad thing, but at least, like I said, nowadays we can sit back and enjoy all the World Championship Wrestling's contribution to the industry.